Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we're just going to dive right in. Dress of a noble, a well-made, vivid burgundy-colored dress. This is the clothing of the nobles who were connected to the old Cainhurst bloodline that is now obsolete. And despite having a relatively short description, there are 2 points I think it's worth touching on with this item. First, it's interesting to me that the official translation relates this back to the Forsaken Castle Cainhurst, as opposed to what I've interpreted as the old Cainhurst bloodline, because as far as I can tell, there's no direct mention of the castle itself in the description. Of course, as we've come to learn from other game texts, that's not to say there was never such a direct mention of the castle, but I think it's also possible this could come down to an alternative interpretation of the Japanese in question. Specifically, it may be related to how a particular string of modifiers is broken down. If you interpret the opening line of the Japanese as a single set of phrases all modifying the noun ketsumyaku, or bloodline, you wind up with something like my literal translation of the old Cainhurst bloodline that is now obsolete. If, on the other hand, you interpret one part of the line to be modifying Cainhurst and only the next part of the line as applying to bloodline, the result is instead the old bloodline of the now-in-decline Cainhurst. This may seem like a bit of a shift from the term obsolete that I used before, but both stem from the sense of the original word stareru of the decline of something that was once thriving. Anyway, using this second interpretation, I think it makes sense to interpret the now-in-decline Cainhurst portion of the phrase to be a reference to how Cainhurst Castle is now an abandoned ruin, and thus render this the Forsaken Castle Cainhurst. In other words, just by the nature of how someone interprets a string of modifiers, it's possible to come away from the same line with a very different understanding. Fortunately, this is a case where, one way or another, I think the main point comes through. Either way, the player knows Cainhurst Castle was once a thriving place associated with a particular bloodline, and those nobles wore this dress. And there is one more point I'd like to make about it, but let's talk to this guy.
I'll spare you one nugget of advice. Beware the old hag. I saw her slipping away in the night. No one in their right mind would do that. Not on a night like this. So you see, that can only mean one thing.
I'm not sure I get it. Why don't I go back to what I wanted to say about this dress, specifically about what color it is. In the original Japanese, it's described as being enji-iro. Iro is a word that can be used on its own to mean color, or added to other words as a descriptor to show that those words are meant to be taken as colors, similar to how we might say something is cream-colored in English. In other words, this dress is being described as enji-colored. So what's enji exactly? Well, there isn't really a direct equivalent in English, which is why I think it's worth spending some time on. Historically, this is a word used to describe the color that results from dyeing clothes with a natural pigment made from red safflower flowers. Following this line of reasoning, we might say that the closest English equivalent might be Carthamus red, which is one of the official terms used for that pigment today. But there are at least 2 problems with this. First, it's a technical term that's going to stick out in a sentence like a finely tailored Carthamus red dress. And second, most people won't have a reference for what this shade of red even looks like. An alternative solution, then, would be to use a similar English word to describe the color of the dress. Looked at in a dictionary, enji-iro is described as a dark red, and English has several specific terms for colors that match that description. Here, the official translation of Bordeaux, which is the French term for the color generally described in English as burgundy, makes a good deal of sense to me. Not only is it describing a deep red color, it's also using the French variation that's likely to come across as fancier or finer, which I think is quite fitting for this noble dress. Also, keep in mind that there's a very good chance the translators never saw the actual color of the dress. For that reason, the cultural associations of the term Bordeaux may have been a way to justify the use of that particular descriptor in the absence of what might have been a better color match. For instance, simply thinking of these colors in the abstract is what led me to my own more literal variation of vivid burgundy, because as I think this comparison chart of the colors as identified by Wikipedia shows, that's closer to the theoretical color of enji. But while terms that refer to specific colors make for some good examples of how words or concepts don't always line up perfectly between one language and another, there are other terms for which this is true, and I'd like to briefly turn now to one from the narrow-minded man's most recent dialogue. You may have noticed that in my more literal version of the line, at one point I have him say, "That's not what a sane one would do." But the original Japanese term, matomo, has a bit more nuance here, and it's actually come up a few times before, typically as a descriptor for survivors. In a general sense, this term describes someone or something that is fulfilling positive cultural expectations, but it can be a little bit hard to pin down to one word in English. Example sentences I found online include things from the concept of a decent living to the idea of taking someone seriously or making a sane judgment. Given the context of Bloodborne, then, when a character references Matomo na ikinokori, they're talking about not just any survivor, but one who is still proper, or who still fulfills the general cultural expectations of an ordinary person. In this sense, describing someone as sane or non-bestial would be an appropriate way to understand the idea of Matomo. So when this guy tells us going outside on the night of the hunt is something no one in their right mind would do, he does mean that. But he's also casting aspersions on the old woman by saying this is something no decent person would do. And I thought that particular bit of extra nuance was worth bringing up given this character's tendency to disparage everyone else. But I think it's time we moved on. Knight's single tuft of hair, an accessory that the Knights of Cainhurst were fond of, modeled after a single tuft of silver hair bound together. The Cainhurst way of doing things is nostalgismic and also grandiose. Precisely for this reason, the disposal of beasts was adorned with beauty and honor as a kind of blood-soaked degenerate art. And since the opening lines for each piece are slightly different, I'll read them for each one in turn. Next is Knight Attire, attire of the Cainhurst Knights, a very aristocratic piece, adorned with gold-threaded embroidery. Knight Gloves, gloves of the Cainhurst Knights, a very aristocratic piece, with gold-threaded embroidery adorning red fabric. And finally, Knight Leg Piece of the Cainhurst Knights, a very aristocratic piece using high-quality leather. And while those variations are fairly small and translated straightforwardly, I do like how they technically make each piece in this set unique. Tailoring each one of these generic descriptions just a bit fits nicely with the idea that this is a set of clothing meant to demonstrate the wearer's prestige, though as we know from the description of the writer Palash, the knights themselves were technically servants. Anyway, as far as the overall translation goes, there are a couple things I think it's worth going into, because I think they make for some good demonstrations of the ways in which thinking in non-literal terms can help resolve potential issues. First of all, you may have noticed that when I read out my more literal version, I made use of the word nostalgismic, which of course isn't very natural, but it does mirror the Japanese in the use of suffixes to modify the base word in question. And the full term we're looking at here is kaiko shugi teki, which I think it's worth breaking down into its component parts so you can see what I mean. Its base is the word kaiko, which is very similar to nostalgia, having a fond reminiscence of the past. Shugi is used to express that the noun it is modifying represents some sort of guiding principle or belief. This brings us from nostalgia to nostalgism. Finally, teki is a suffix that turns the noun it modifies into an adjective characterized by the base term. For instance, riso teki turns the noun ideal, like in the sentence, I am guided by an ideal, into the adjective ideal that might be used to describe an ideal day. Combining the two suffixes results in a description of something characterized by the principle in question. So, to reflect something typical of nostalgism using a suffix, I've used the term nostalgismic. The result, however, is a strikingly unnatural word. Arguably, nostalgic could work better here, but describing a method of doing things as nostalgic doesn't quite fit the common usage of that word. And saying the Cainhurst way of doing things is nostalgic could be confusing. But if you abandon the restriction of literally recreating the suffixes that might be used in English to match the Japanese, you can simply describe this method as characterized by a reverence for that which is in the past. In this sense, I think you can see why saying the Cainhurst way is a mix of nostalgia and bombast is a pretty good solution. Finally, on a similar note, I think calling the headpiece a wig is a great solution to more potentially awkward wording. We learn in the description that this item resembles a single tuft of silver hair. This requires one logical leap to identify as a ponytail, a simple term for hair gathered into a single bunch, held together at the base. Then, using the term wig involves a second leap of logic to think what an item resembling a ponytail of silver hair, used as a headpiece, would represent. I think these are all elegant translations, but let's move on. Wisdom of the higher rank ones. Various beings are called higher rank ones. This is a fragment of their, beings that are close to gods, lost knowledge, gain much enlightenment by using it. Once, Willem of Byrgenwerth proclaimed, "Our thoughts are of too low dimension. We need more eyes." So there are a number of points to consider here, but I'd like to start by revisiting the old topic of singular versus plural in Japanese and some of the interesting implications that go along with that particular grammatical point. Way back in episode 20 of Translationborne, I mentioned how the moon rune doesn't really specify whether it's referring to one great one in one nightmare, several great ones in several nightmares, or several great ones in one nightmare. In fact, up until now, there hasn't been a great deal of clear-cut evidence that there even is more than one being known as a Great One. That's just changed with this item. The opening line of the Japanese not only makes it obvious that there are multiple Great Ones, it also strongly implies that there is more than one kind of thing that is called a Great One. It does this by modifying the noun for existence or being with the term moro, which can mean anything from various things or a great deal of things to many people. Going by the interpretation that moro no sonzai would work out to various beings then, not only do we have a clear plurality of these beings, we also seem to have a variety of them. Unfortunately, this doesn't really tell us anything definitive in terms of what the moon rune is referencing, but it does verify in pretty solid terms some basic facts about the Great Ones as they inhabit the world of Bloodborne. But I'm not just interested in the implications for the greater lore of the game. What I also think is fascinating from a more translation-oriented approach is the dichotomy in how the singular and plurals are used for this same item. Notice that the official translation for the name of the item is in the form of a singular possessive. Also, if you look at the quick summary of the item that I don't normally highlight in my textual comparisons, you can see that officially this is referred to as a fragment of lost wisdom, though the identical phrase in the body of the description has this time been rendered fragments of lost wisdom, switching to the plural. This creates the effect, at least in my mind, that the body of the item description is explaining what these items are in general, while the item name and quick description are referring to the specific piece of lost wisdom that our player character has found. It's an interesting detail that I think works out okay, though I'm not sure what the problem would have been if fragment were left in the singular in both cases. Actually, there's another mismatch between the quick description and the main body of the item's text that I don't think works out quite as well, and that makes me wonder whether maybe this was all the result of something else. Note that the Japanese phrase "shio ni yori oku keimo o eru" has been officially translated both as "used to gain much insight" and also "used to gain insight." Here, there's not much ambiguity or other possible interpretations. "Used to gain much insight" is a better translation. I say this because these phrases are hinting at specific game mechanics. Before we get to them though, why don't we try and gain some wisdom from old Master Willem himself? Where should we be looking if we want to gain wisdom? Not very helpful. I think maybe the thing to do now is put him out of his misery. To get back to the point though, if you look at the Japanese first for Madman's knowledge and then for Great One's wisdom, you'll see that while both use a similar phrase, the Great One's wisdom version contains the extra word oku, which is where the much comes from in the official version. And this is meant to be an indication that while using Madman's knowledge will get you 1 point of insight, using Great One's wisdom gets you 2. This makes me wonder if perhaps the item names and their quick descriptions were listed separately in the original files from their corresponding descriptions, or if perhaps this is another one of those items that saw a number of revisions to the Japanese text. Whatever the explanation though, this is an odd case of one part of an item's official translation being more accurate than another. And on that puzzling note, we've reached the end of another episode. As always, please let me know if you have any feedback for me, and until next time, thanks for watching everyone.